Hi, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Ed. Um, our new coffee house theme, as Marcus said, is building bridges, and Virginia did a great job in starting us off in the first of the series. If I go back about 5 years ago, maybe a bit more, I started getting connected to this notion that we needed some fundamental changes. And I started doing some research, and one of the first groups that I connected to was the American Monetary Association or Institute. And of course, Mr. Zarlinga wrote such great stuff. And there are other names that I came across and websites. One was Saving Communities, Dan Sullivan's. And it was quite an array of articles there, including people like Clarence Darrow. And then I came across cooperative individualism, which sounded a bit like an oxymoron, but it had, like Dan, incredible variety. In fact, Dan was on that as well, incredible variety of excerpts and papers by all sorts of authors. And perhaps the one that had the greatest number was Ed Dodson. And I read some of this material, and I couldn't believe how much was written. I didn't have enough time just to read it and digest it. At any rate, through that, I learned a lot. I saw some YouTube materials, and visited some of the AMI conferences, saw people like Joe Bongiovanni speaking, and some high-end economists, and but it was just sort of too much to take in. And what we need is people who synthesize it, and people like Dan and Ed and Joe are the people who do that for us. And that's really where we're going with this building bridges, connecting with other groups that we can learn from and synthesize all this good analysis that's out there, and then help create a movement in which we demand those things. So Ed is going to help us tonight with introducing how a slightly different perspective on things and a very related perspective can contribute to monetary reform and just money. So take it away, Ed.
Well, first thing I'm going to do is share my screen. I've prepared a PowerPoint for this talk. What you're going to see basically is I put together 46 slides out of a semester-long course that I teach titled Understanding Our Political Economy. And so that's what you should see as the first slide. It's now on your screen, correct? I hope. Okay, so the approach to this course is based on long years of study and probably now almost 40 years of teaching political economy to adults based on the writings of Henry George. Not Henry George alone, but Henry George is a primary contributor to the science of political economy as I use in the classroom. As Joe alluded to, I have a project online. It's called the School of Cooperative Individualism. And that term, cooperative individualism, is the term that I feel best describes the principles that Henry George embraced in his writings. And there's a long history to those principles. And I've identified in my own writing, I devoted a chapter in a book I wrote in 2002 on the subject, that Thomas Paine I think of as the architect of cooperative individualism. If you read a combination of his works, The Rights of Man, The Age of Reason, Agrarian Justice, and his other writings, the principles that he embraced and promoted in his time were eventually largely picked up by Henry George and by many others who came came afterward. So my approach to teaching the subject of political economy based on Henry George starts out with this basic argument that political economy has its roots in moral philosophy. And so political economists were more moral philosophers than they were economists. They sought to identify the socio-political arrangements and institutions that would most likely stimulate cooperative relations between individuals. And they achieved various degrees of success during their periods of time. I mean, here's just an image of all of the thinkers that Henry George, on whose shoulders Henry George stood. And so when Henry George chose political economy as his discipline, he was following in their footsteps. And his serious writings on the subject began while he was living in California during the 1860s. And at that time, he served as an editor of the state Democratic Party's newspaper. So his politics were that of the Democratic Party of the time, but modified by what he was learning all the time doing his own investigations. He eventually accumulated a library estimated about 800 books. And so he studied all of the contemporary political economists of his time and his predecessors. And then in March of 1879, after 2 years of research and writing, he came up with his book, Progress and Poverty. He sent it off to a publisher in New York. The publisher rejected it, basically telling Henry George, hey, this is a great book, but there's no general market for such a book. I mean, it's, hundreds and hundreds of pages long, and how many people are actually going to buy it? But he was convinced that the book had a message to send. And so he decided to have the book published himself. He was a printer by his early training. And so he set the type for the book himself, produced the plates, and then came out with an author's edition. By the way, if you happen to be able to acquire an author's edition of Progress and Poverty now, it's probably worth about $15,000. So a small author's edition came out, and then the New York publisher decided that with those plates, it would agree to come out with an edition of the book himself. So George basically went east from California to New York to promote the book, and he went on extensive lecture tours to promote it. It sold remarkably well. And as months went by, and as George's name became more prominent in the newspapers, and as his lectures attracted larger audience, the book was selling like 30 or 40,000 copies a month, which was unheard of for a book on this subject. So other books followed, lecture tours continued, and then in 1886, he established a weekly newspaper in New York City called The Standard. And his solution to the problems of generational poverty and economic instability that he was putting in his books was really a fiscal solution. He argued for the elimination of all taxation, that the revenue for public goods and services, absent taxation, would come from the public collection of economic rent. And that term, economic rent, in political economy meant the value of land, or the potential annual rental value of land. And you can expand that to include any assets with an inelastic supply. So I don't want to hit you up with too much jargon on economics, but this idea that nature has an inelastic supply, it's finite, has a special character in the study of political economy that Henry George discovered and wrote about. Well, he continued to write and lecture for the next decade. In 1886, he had been drafted to run for mayor of New York City, didn't win, but came darn close. He actually beat the Republican candidate, Theodore Roosevelt, lost, of course, to Tammany Hall. And the newspapers the next day said that thousands of votes for Henry George were floating down the Hudson River. So he knew he wasn't going to get elected, but he said he ran because he wanted to raise hell. And his campaign did that. So over the next 10 years, he kept writing and lecturing, went on world tours. The ideas that he was talking about were embraced by leaders all across the world, including people like Leo Tolstoy in Russia. Sun Yat-sen became one of his followers, the nationalist Chinese leader eventually, and many others, particularly in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, Irish reformers like Michael Davitt, all embraced Henry George and his ideas. So by the 1890s, he was a world famous person, and he had a large movement that had built up to try to implement his ideas. His health was failing, however. He had a stroke in 1891, recovered from that. And by 1897, he was writing what would turn out to be his last book, which would be titled The Science of Political Economy. But before he finished the book, he was drafted by labor members and independents in New York City to run for mayor again. He was told by his physician if he did it, he would probably die in the process because his health was that fragile. So unfortunately, he said he would do it because he thought it was his public duty. And just before the election, he was delivering a campaign speech and had a second stroke and died the next morning. So there was all of these ideas out there, and George was only 59 years old when he died. So had he lived, he might have had an opportunity to have much more of an impact on both the political realm and the academic realm. What he and others understood is that markets operate within systems of law, and systems of law are open to judgment as to fairness and equity. So George asked whether the laws established equality of opportunity or secured and protected entrenched forms of privilege. And he concluded that the latter was the case in all advanced societies, that there was this process of entrenched privilege that grabbed a hold of societies and caused a redistribution of wealth from those who produced it to non-producers, to a class of the population that the French would call rentiers. Well, the generation of social scientists who began their careers in the 1870s or thereabouts, they sought to convert political economy into the scientific discipline that would be governed by the laws of Newtonian mechanics that became embraced by economists in the 20th century. Their objective was to formulate an economic model that could be described by a solvable system of equations. This was not the analysis that political economists performed, not the analysis that Henry George performed in his life. Another strong motivation of the first generation of economists was the growing demand by government for statistics. Militarism and industrial production required an understanding of a nation's population and its skills, its natural resources, and its productive capabilities. So this was a perfect opportunity for universities in Europe to offer advanced degrees in economics for people who had the inclination to gather these statistics, apply mathematical models to them to see how they affected economic output. So this is an era of imperialism and aggressive nation states. They also sought to understand if they didn't have resources domestically, where would they find them? And what would it take to get them, either peacefully or by intervention? And so the economists, the new economists that were studying in the universities, they were only too willing to oblige, because It gave them status in society. It gave them the opportunity for a solid career. And so we begin to see that political economy, the study of moral principles, started to be displaced by this much more narrow or subdiscipline of economics in the universities. And one of the leading figures in this story was William Stanley Jevons. He was first trained in Britain as a chemist and a mathematician. So you can see where his perspectives are going to come from once he starts to take on the study of economics. And his lasting contribution to economics was the concept of the general equilibrium. So if anyone who's taken Economics 101 has been exposed to the concept of equilibrium, and that is, it's an assertion that all relations in an economy are self-regulating, so that any disturbance sets in motion forces that tend to restore the balance. So this is a basic tenet of modern economic analysis. And so many economists would argue the worst thing that one can do in a period of instability is to intervene. Just let the markets settle, let the dust settle, and the markets will return to this state of general equilibrium. And if you look in any textbook, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see a supply-demand, graph like this, showing that where supply and demand meet, there is a state of equilibrium. How this applies to an entire society, however, is much more complicated. And so general equilibrium theory, as descriptive of the real world, has always been severely criticized by those who do not see it as an effective way to analyze what's going on in the world. Another aspect of modern economics, I'm sorry, I forgot to move the slide. There's the supply-demand graph. I have to keep up with my lecture notes. Another thing that early economists came up with was a way to analyze what happens when choices are made in societies. Economists provided advice to governments and then to corporations by looking at what a society could produce. And then the society that was making decisions about, for example, if I need an army of 100,000 men, and I need to supply this army with all the equipment it needs to invade Africa, some other place. Okay, what are the consequences? How many guns can I produce and still produce enough consumer goods? So this analysis came to be called the production possibilities curve. And it's basically a way that economists said to the government, okay, if you want to produce X number of tanks, then you might not be able to produce X number of homes for your residents, for your citizens. And so we get into, in the 20th century later, it was often referred to as the balance between guns and butter. Guns on the military side, butter on the consumer side. Now, one economist who looked at the history of economics as it evolved out of political economy and came up with a lot of factual analysis that showed that there was actually a well-designed conspiracy to discredit Henry George's analysis was this fellow, Mason Gaffney. Mace taught at the University of California for most the last half of the 20th century. He passed away about a year and a half ago. I don't remember exactly the time, but in 1994 he co-authored a book titled "The Corruption of Economics" with the British economics journalist Fred Harrison. And I put this entire book online. It's on my website, the School of Cooperative Individualism, and I strongly endorse its message and recommend to anyone who wants some clear insight into the details about how this happened, how economics came to be controlled by powerful interests who were very much concerned to protect their entrenched privilege and not allow Henry George's analysis to get an honest review in the public dialogue. This book tells that story very well. When George is writing Progress and Poverty, his reading of other political economists convinced him that the real problem that they had was inconsistent use of terms. I mean, he studied, Adam Smith, he studied David Ricardo, he studied the physiocrats, other writers, and he felt as though their analysis was impacted by the fact that they did not consistently define the terms that they used. And so in his writing, he made a clear effort to specifically come up with definitions for basic terms in political economy. Land, labor, and capital are described as the factors of production. And so he defines land as the entire natural world. And this includes our atmosphere, not just surface land, but all natural processes. Thus, for example, this includes frequencies on the broadcast spectrum, flight paths of satellites around the Earth, or even one of the most interesting ones that would fall in this is takeoff and landing slots at airports. Why is that part of nature? Well, no two planes can occupy the same space at the same time without pretty disastrous consequences. So that means that part of nature is finite and it has to be rationed somehow. And how do you ration it? Well, you have a number of choices. You can have government ration it with laws and regulations, or you can have the market ration it. A big question for all of us that George explored was how access to nature is to be granted or awarded. Is access to land, to nature, a right, or is it a privilege? Should control over land be exclusive or conditional, awarded by competitive auction, perhaps under a leasehold basis, or deeded by governments and thereafter sold owner to owner? So fundamentally, he's asking, is it appropriate to treat nature as a commodity to be bought and sold? Or is there something different about nature that makes nature different from the things that we produce? So that goes on to the second and third factor of production in political economy. People and the goods we produce are referred to as the active factors of production in his writings, as labor and as capital goods. Now, he uses the term capital when he means capital goods. And if I have any criticism of George at all, it's that I wish he had always added the word goods after the term capital, because as we now, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, as we hear the word capital used all the time, the meaning of it in everyday discourse is very much confused. So George is talking about tangible goods that we produce by our labor, with tools or machinery, where the natural resources to do it come from land. And then he talks about what is produced, and he says, well, what we produce, when we apply our labor to land with or without tools, we get stuff, we get goods. And these goods most of the time are going to be considered wealth. And we're dealing with wealth that has certain characteristics. So George is, as a political economist, he's also concerned about statistics, like as our modern economist, about determining what should be included in the calculation of our aggregate wealth, for example. And so he applies these three characteristics to what he would include in his definition of wealth. He says it has to be the product of labor, with or without the assistance of other capital goods. It must have exchange value in the marketplace, and he says it has to satisfy some human desire. So this brings us to a point where you're going to be more interested, and that is what he has to say about the role of money. So George's definition of wealth means that some forms of assets that we commonly think of as wealth and that have an exchange value in markets, he would not consider wealth. These include all forms of money, currency, and financial instruments. So if they're not wealth, what are they? Well, they're claims on wealth. That's just what he said. These are financial instruments are claims on real wealth. It gets more complex because obviously precious metals are real tangible things. But when they're used as money, he's arguing that they're not part of the wealth that contributes to economic activity, that they're set aside as something different. They're set aside as backing for paper currency. They're minted into coinage that's circulated as a medium of exchange. But most importantly, in his whole discussion, land is not included in the definition of wealth for the basic reason that nature is not produced by human labor. Nature, he says, is the source of all wealth, but it's not wealth itself. This is hard for us to put our arms around today because we think of nature as property. We can buy or sell, all aspects of nature. I mean, we're now talking about how we can have patents on ideas, genetic, formula. So this is a very difficult subject for us today to understand how nature cannot or should not be treated as wealth, but as the source of wealth. In the most basic sense, each of us requires access to the earth to survive. This is part of what George was telling us, that the earth must be then treated as a commons, accessible by all, but under rules that guarantee full equality of opportunity. So the earth has plenty of resources, and if we treat it as a commons and we come up with rules that guarantee full equality of opportunity, George concludes there's no reason that anyone should be poor. We're all born with abilities, not the same abilities, but we all have potential. And we have, 2 hands, 2 legs. If we're born, without any physical defects or mental problems, we can produce wealth as long as we're given access to nature. That's his basic argument. The question is, do we have systems of law that provide this equality of opportunity? And when he looks at the systems of law that are in place in countries all around the world, including the United States, his answer is, of course, the answer is no, that there are serious systemic flaws in the system of law that's in place around the world. Bear with me a second. Okay. So if in fact the earth is our shared commons, this should have become a governing principle of our systems of property law in every society. That's his argument. Other than the oceans, at least so far, however, most of the planet today is claimed by some people to the exclusion of others. We have nation states, and the borders of our nation states say basically what's inside these borders belongs to us. And those of you who are not part of us have no claim on these resources. In fact, if you want to come into our country and cross these borders, you may have to go through a long process of application, or as is occurring at the southern border of the United States today, there is a great deal of resistance to allowing more and more people to come in. There is this feeling that resources are scarce. George would argue it's not nature that's causing this. It's our systems of law, property law, that make resources scarce because they are monopolized. That there's a concentration of ownership and control over land and natural resources that is unnatural, that it's enforced by cultural norms, it's enforced by coercive police power of the state, etc. So the challenge that George had writing at the time he was how can this be changed? We have long centuries of entrenched privilege in our systems of law. We have landlordism, basically the dominant system that exists all around the world. Should we have violent revolutions to solve this problem? The history of violent revolutions tends, he thinks, that you overturn one system with another, and the system that comes into place to replace the old one is no better, and often is worse. So George basically, through his study of political economy, came up with a fairly simple solution, at least from a theoretical point of view. From a political point of view, not so simple. But basically, his idea was that we need to figure out a way to charge people, make them pay for the privilege of controlling part of the earth. And the market could do that. What people are willing to pay to have control over some portion of land, some portion of natural resources on an annual basis. And that amount would be paid into the state or the community, into government. Now, one of his observations is, because this idea was not in place, that owners, those who controlled land, were actually taxed much less than those who produce goods and services. That the taxes on commerce, on taxes on businesses that produce goods, on services, on income, almost everywhere around the world, were much more onerous than the taxes paid by those who controlled land and natural resources. And one impact of that was it made speculation in land and natural resources very much of a profitable investment. And so in the United States, where property law allowed land ownership, and there was a lot of land to be bought and sold by his date, the low annual taxation of land ownership attracted a lot of investors who acquired a lot of land, not for development, but for speculation. And so land could be held out of use for years, decades, or even longer. And so the result of this was that as government took on more and more responsibility for public goods and services, including military, taxes were increased on everything else. Every other asset, every other activity experienced heavier and heavier tax burdens, while land got off very cheaply. And it only made the situation even more difficult for people who didn't have land. You can think about it in terms of what's happened over in the United States, really probably since the mid-1970s. I'm 74 years old now. I am one of the earlier baby boomers. When I became an adult, there were huge numbers of us that were becoming adults at the same time. And we wanted to leave our family home, leave our parents, get out from under the thumb of our parents, establish our own lives. Well, what did we need? We needed housing. And so you had millions of these young adults coming onto the market, and the only way that housing prices or apartment rents would remain stable is if the supply met the demand, and supply just couldn't keep up. And so land prices started to go up in the 70s and have kept going up year after year after year. So what is one of the most serious affordability problems for young adults today in 2021? Apartment rents or getting into housing. And so we have a serious crisis in the economy, in our society, with people not being able to find an affordable place to live. It's been going on since Henry George's time, but just at an accelerated pace. The same problem with the same solution that he proposed, but the solution could never find sufficient political support, but it did find tremendous amount of opposition that was well funded. So this is from a scientific standpoint, the failure to distinguish land from capital goods under our property law and under taxation policies is the most serious consequence of the confusion that's created by modern economics. If you look at many economics textbooks, the word land may not even be in the index. The result has been to encourage, again, to reward speculation in nature while imposing heavy tax burdens on labor and the owners of real, actual capital goods. So, what George observed is the same thing that's going on today. Just a collection of images here, just to show that population growth leads to changing land uses. You just think about the history. In his time, 90% of the households in the United States still lived on farms. Within a couple generations, we were already becoming a majority urban society. Agricultural land gets converted to business and residential use. Land parcels get divided and divided again to accommodate more buildings. And then we have technologies. The steel girder construction made it possible to build high-rise buildings. You put elevators in them and buildings rise ever higher. They get more reliable heating systems, and then air conditioning opened up regions for high levels of economic activity year-round. So where did people start to move to? As long as there's air conditioning, hey, I can live in Arizona, I can live in Florida, I can live in Southern California. And so in those parts of the country, there was rapid growth and rapid increase in the value of land in these centers of population. So potentially, George would have said, here is a tremendous source of potential public revenue to pay for the public goods and services people want. If only we can get these places to understand that they should be collecting this increase in land value through the tax mechanism. And that's been I've been involved with Henry George's ideas since 1980. And I worked in the financial services sector my whole career, last 20 years at Fannie Mae. And toward the end of my tenure at Fannie Mae, I was able to convince the company's senior people that Henry George's ideas were key to the creation of affordable housing across the country. And they actually sent me out doing public talks to stakeholder groups in different cities about adopting Henry George's ideas, or at least moving in that direction. But I left in 2005, and there was no one else in the company who shared my conviction. And so the whole idea of supporting this as a part of a what you would call it a business-oriented policy measure promoted to government died on the vine. Well, so Henry George looked at the economic output in our society as sort of a pie. As this image of the world map I've divided up into the three sections. That the aggregate wealth is divided into three distributions: rent, wages, and interest. Interest being the term he used as a return to capital goods, and rent returned to the factored land. Okay, so in George's analysis, this is a closed system. There's no leakage. Everything that we produce, all the wealth that we produce goes to one of the factors of production. Well, that leads to a very interesting analysis, because it shows that over time, as the size of the amount of wealth increases, more and more of it is going to rent. Now, I created a fairly simplified view of this to give you the context. So go back as far as we want to in history, and there's just us, and we don't have any tools. So we go out and we work the land, we pick berries, we pick from trees, whatever we produce is our wages. 100% of what we produce is our wages, our labor applied to nature, and that's what we get. It's not big, but then we begin to discover that if we don't consume everything we produce, we may be able to produce more later on. Like, okay, we pick apples off of a tree, and we see that when the seeds fall, they'll grow another apple tree. So we start harvesting the apples for the seeds, and we grow an apple orchard, or all kinds of domesticate plants, and we domesticate animals, and we then begin to change the form of the tools that we use. So over time, we might come up with a stone axe, something simple, but then we learn metallurgy, and we move from bronze to copper to iron, and eventually to steel. All of those developments help us to increase the amount of wealth we can produce with the same labor input. And so the pie gets much bigger, but now we have tools that we're using. And so some of the wealth that we produced, we can attribute, if this is just us, it's our wealth. But if you're a political economist and you're trying to analyze, well, how much more wealth was produced because we had these tools, we had these technologies. So now the next phase shows that because of these tools, we are able to produce a lot more output with every input of labor. And so we get much more wealth. Our labor component increases because we're more effective. We've learned how to use our tools more effectively, but our tools themselves have produced a tremendous amount of additional output. And then finally, in the third phase of what happens in history, land becomes scarce. The initial analysis of this process was developed as a scientific principle by the English political economist David Ricardo. And Ricardo came up with what he called the land of rent. And basically what the land of rent says is that so long as all the land that's freely available has equal potential productivity, no one will pay anyone for the use of land. And therefore no portion of what is produced is rent. But eventually, all the best land will come under control. And so people who want to now use land and don't have direct control of it have to go to the next quality, and then the next quality. And so eventually in a society, those who control the better qualities of land, whether it's for agriculture or a block of land in a center of a city, that land is going to have a huge amount of rental value in the marketplace. And so the question that George said, since this value is created by population growth and by the aggregate investment of people in public goods and services, it does not rightfully belong to any individual or any entity. It belongs to the community as a whole. And that was the campaign that he went on to try to convince people that the rental value of nature, of land, belonged to the community, but that earned income flows from producing goods and providing services did not. Now, George didn't ignore the function of money. He was writing at a time of intense debate over the role of banks and how the banks ought to be regulated, and over what, if anything, ought to be backing paper currency. I mean, there was the long period of wildcat banking that I'm sure many of you know intimately. And there was a great debate over whether or not wildcat banking should be curtailed. whether or not all banking should be regulated by the federal government. And back and forth, these debates went in the United States between the state and federal government proposals. So we had state currencies, we then had state chartered banks, we had federal currencies. During the Civil War, we had the greenbacks. And one of the things about the greenbacks that George wrote about a little bit was the fact that the greenbacks were successful during the Civil War in helping to curtail inflation, because the promise was that after the war was over, eventually those greenbacks could be redeemed in gold or silver certificates. And gold or silver certificates were redeemable in gold or silver if you wanted to. And so that's part of this whole period that George was writing in. So he understood how important it was. He came in his writing, here's what he gave as the definition of money. He says, money is a general medium of exchange, the common flow through which wealth is transformed from one form to another. So he looked at it as something outside of the system of wealth production and distribution that he was analyzing. He knew about the history of money, from writers like Stephen Zarlenga. We know that throughout history, everything from cattle, beads, salt, barley, whiskey, and tobacco served as a medium of exchange. Commodity money circulated on wide acceptance and on scarcity, and also on the high amount of labor required to produce a commodity. But beginning with the discovery of the touchstone, it became possible to test soft metals for their purity. This allowed one to quickly determine the content of a particular metal in a coin or in a raw metal. And so from that point on, really, gold and silver, although relatively scarce, spread around the globe as the standard forms of money. An important characteristic was the fact that they are virtually indestructible. And so there were other innovations, and I'm just going to cover a few of them quickly. Early coins were subject to counterfeiting, that is debasement. So the stamping of coins with images made counterfeiting a bit more difficult, but coins could still be shaved to produce a small raw metal. So if you had enough coins and you shaved a little bit off of them, maybe you had 10 coins, you could shave the edges and end up with a brand new counterfeit coin that would pass in the market as equal to the others. So eventually, governments that were issuing these coins figured it out. And the innovation they came up with was to put ridges on the coins. So it was much more difficult to shave them. And so coinage then was established in a much more stable way as the medium of exchange. The big change that occurred in banking and in monetary creation was the founding of the Bank of Amsterdam. And the Bank of Amsterdam was a deposit bank protected by the city of Amsterdam, basically backed by the city. And what did the Bank of Amsterdam do? It took in both foreign and local coinage, which was reminted. It took in gold and silver bullion. And what it did was produce coins that had a standard content of metallic content. And then they would hold those coins on deposit and issue certificates, paper certificates to depositors, which then circulated in the marketplace. So this was full reserve banking. The bank had coinage of a standard weight and metallic content backing every piece of paper that was in circulation. They took a small minting fee and management fee and then credited depositors for the balance. And that system would have worked, but human nature being what it is. The directors of the bank speculated in the tulip bubble upswing of the 1630s. And then when the bubble burst, the bank assets were hit pretty hard. The bank was also at the time doing something that it shouldn't have done. The bank had its own assets from the fees that it had earned, et cetera, but it was making loans to the city of Amsterdam and to the Dutch East India Company in amounts far above their own assets. And this left the bank with fractional reserves. So even so, with these problems, the bank's role as an intermediary in the global economy was strong enough that the bank actually survived until it was dissolved in 1796. But unfortunately, after the tulip bubble bursting, the era of full reserve banking ended. And so the Bank of Amsterdam's importance slowly fell to second place behind the Bank of England, chartered in 1694, but not as a full reserve bank. So the Bank of England is chartered with specie raised from investors. This specie was then loaned to the British government, but the bank was given permission by the government to issue banknotes equal to its original specie. Get that story again? Raised specie from investors, which it then loaned to the bank, to the British government. So it was no longer on their books. They had a receivable, but they were allowed to issue banknotes equal to the total original specie. And the government basically said, okay, if your depositors come and want their money and you don't have enough, we will give it to you. So this really ushered in the era of fractional reserve banking. So fast forward to the 19th century, and we have long histories of economic crises, somewhat driven by problems with the banking system and the money system, also driven by speculation in property markets around the globe and by imperialism. I mean, Adam Smith basically set the stage, and he said in his writing in The Wealth of Nations, imperialism is going to be good for a few, but not for the many, because it'll benefit the monopolists who gain control of those overseas markets, but the taxes to support the military will be paid for by broad public at home. And so there's all this going on at the same time. And in the 19th century, there's a big debate over whether gold or silver or both should back paper currency. This is the debate over bimetallism, and you may be familiar with William Jennings Bryan, who is the leader of the call for bimetallism and for silver, because he said, we're not going to be crucified on a cross of gold. And it created a lot of political stir in the United States. Bryan ran for president twice, defeated, but there was a lack of gold throughout the western part of the United States. And in fact, China during the 18th and 19th century required that all of the goods sold be paid for with silver. So a lot of the world's silver had been drained off to China. There was a shortage of it. And so eventually gold replaced silver as the backing for most currencies. Now I'm going real fast, and I'll be done in just a few minutes so we can have conversation, but I hope this story is coming together for you. Okay, so 1907, we have the crash of Wall Street and the banking panic. And in the United States, it only gets resolved when J.P. Morgan, the top banker in the United States, basically agrees to make loans to most of the banks that were having cash flow problems. And the bank panic was caused in part because there were speculative bubbles in real estate and the stock market that burst. Unemployment in 1907 was officially reported as over 20%. The real rate of unemployment could have been as high as 35%. Millions lost their deposits as thousands of banks collapsed across the nation. There was nothing like deposit insurance. You took your chances by putting the money in any bank, whether you'd get it if the bank collapsed. So this triggered a lot of investigations, commissions, Congress came up with ideas, and eventually Woodrow Wilson signs the legislation to reform the currency system, and we get the Federal Reserve. What's the Federal Reserve? It's a system that is overseen by the United States government, but it is basically a system owned by private commercial banks that are members of the Federal Reserve System. And so they determine, at least initially in the early years, they determined the Federal Reserve policy without a whole lot of government intervention. Ostensibly, Fed policies are supposed to be independent of political influence, but that's, in fairness, probably never been the case. In 1933, as the country was hit with yet another depression, the government took the dramatic step of closing down the gold market and thus ended its commitment to redeem gold certificates. And in fact, by this executive order, people were supposed to turn in all the privately held gold that they had, and they would be paid a specific amount of money for it. I couldn't find any record ever of how much of the total privately held gold was actually turned in, but quite a bit was actually turned in. And a lot of reforms took place during the 30s, and one of the important ones was the adoption of banking reforms and the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And so that idea, if the banks have to pay an insurance premium to FDIC based on the assessment of how well their banks are run and how much risk they pose to the system, then consumers, depositors, are going to feel safer. And so we get deposit insurance. And so people now know that if a bank goes belly up, that whatever they have on deposit up to some limit is going to be paid to them. And that system is still in place today. And during the last crisis, there was an increase in the level of coverage under FDIC, although the money there to pay off depositors was not coming from the banks. It was coming from the federal government. And so a lot was happening, during this period with a lot of banking reforms. A Mormon banker named Mariner Eccles was brought to Washington to become chairman of the Federal Reserve System. And his autobiography is a book that you all might want to read. It's called Beckoning Frontiers. And Eccles was, without ever having taken an economics course, he was very Keynesian in his thinking. And he is credited with doing a lot to steady the country's financial system during the Depression and then the Second World War. He remained at the Fed until, I think, 1950. But during the later years of the Great Depression, when fascism was raising its head in Europe, wealthy Europeans began sending their gold to the US banks for safekeeping, thinking that if war came, they would definitely be in trouble. So by the time the United States enters the Second World War, the US banks are really flooded with gold. The United States, throughout the Second War, accumulates something like 2/3 of all the world's gold stocks. And so with the end of the Second World War, we get the implementation of Bretton Woods Agreement with the establishment of the US dollar as the current global currency, reserve currency. And everything seems great until the 70s. What happens in the 70s? Well, we get stagflation, we get OPEC. And so what is OPEC? But it is a rent-seeking monopoly. Okay. The value of oil in the ground keeps going up and up and up because my generation, younger generation are consuming more and more. The world's population is growing by leaps and bounds. And so there is this supply-demand disequilibrium, in a sense, that there's not enough oil being produced. The United States is importing oil, haven't yet found all of the new reserves. And so the price of oil goes up and up and up and up. And that basically is pure rent. It's far above the cost of production, the cost of labor and capital goods. And so there is this huge wealth redistribution in the world to the OPEC producing countries. And we see the results of that, today in terms of what's being done in those countries to use the oil revenue to build basically very different societies. Is it just or not? Well, that's something we can discuss. So a fundamental question is whether that portion of the economy engaged in financial transactions adds to the production of actual wealth or merely results in its redistribution. Is there a loser for every winner is my question. And I worked in the financial sector for 4 decades. I felt like I was doing something good, that I was actually providing services that benefited people and that our industry was compensated for that. But I also understood that there were problems there are problems with how the system was set up. And we can talk about that a little bit, as we finish. So there's been just a wealth of criticism and analysis of our economic system and how the financial system and our real economy work together and at odds. And so, my voice is just one in many, many that you can, explore. And we have all sorts of discussion going on now with the theorist of modern monetary theory. I have my own ideas of what might be done to stabilize our monetary system going forward. My ideas, I have to say, are held by only a very small minority of people who are thinking about these problems. But we're now in uncharted territory, in my view, since what has occurred since the 2008 crash. The question is, have we had any systemic reforms, or have we simply pushed off the next disaster for some years? And one observation I would make about that is the median price of a residential property today in the United States is significantly higher than it was in 2007 on the verge of the last financial crash. And so that's my presentation, and I open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Ed. Appreciate it. I'm sure we will have a line of questions for you or discussion points. If everybody has a question, if you could stop sharing also so I can see what's going on the, if you have a question, please put your hand up and hopefully it'll pop to the front of the screen and I can see what's going on. I will take the moderator's option of asking the first question. It's a simple question just based on your slide. Just curious on what was the purpose of the executive order for citizens to turn in all their gold bullion, certificates, and coins, just the general purpose of it.
The Roosevelt administration was concerned because of the outflow of gold that was occurring. And at the time, and it's still somewhat true, that many people believed that the wealth of a country was determined by its gold stock. So the more gold you had sitting in the vaults somewhere in bullion, the wealthier your country was. So in my view, it's an incorrect analysis of the wealth of a nation. So, but everyone throughout history for centuries is thought the more gold you have, the better off you are. Now, my observation there would be, okay, in a time of drought and collapse of agriculture, you can't eat gold, so it's just part of what was economic theory at the time. Something called the balance of trade. There was a balance of trade theory that was went along with this, that it's better to export than to import. So, export what you produce and import less. And so you have a favorable balance of trade. But, there's a question, does that really make sense? Do you want to give up more goods to other people than what you take in from them in trade? Well, the difference is money, and money can be converted into gold. So you can put more gold in your vault, but your standard of well-being isn't necessarily improved by that.
Thank you. Thank you for the background. So let's go with Dan. Please try to keep your questions as brief as possible so we can get as many people in here. So let's go with Dan, and then we'll go with John Howell.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that several years ago, I had given a talk at the AMI conference in Chicago on the parallels between the land issue and the money issue. And George was very much a greenbacker, and he did note that when banks create money through credit, they create it during the boom years when it's the worst time to create money, and then they stop creating it during downturns when money is actually needed.
They get scared of risk. They become risk averse.
Yeah, but the essential similarity that should interest money people is that George's premise was that people were charging us rent for land that was actually ours, and banks were charging us interest for money that was actually ours. That if we created the money and spent it into circulation, there would be far less debt. And if we taxed the land value, we'd have no taxes, and there would be far less land monopoly. So it was much more elaborate than that, but that's the essence of why the two things go together. And the fact that governments actually don't govern people, they govern land. So you're only governed by France when you're in France. And that land is actually what backs the currency, because you can only tax people if they're on your land. So
it's worth saying that the bankers in the early part of the 20th century were really afraid that the reforms would be that government would take over banking directly and issuing currency, that the Treasury would issue currency directly into circulation. And so the Federal Reserve was their solution to try to prevent the government from doing exactly what the advocates of direct money spending into the economy by the government now want to do.
Very true. Thank you. John Howell.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. My question about the Henry George approach is what about the implications for agriculture? Now, I understand that the idea is that the more efficiently you use the land, then you will be a better competitor in the market. But if you consider a particular chunk of land and somebody tries to grow potatoes on it versus somebody tries to manufacture steel or have a hardware store, it seems like the agriculture loses. How does that work out in the thinking of Henry George in terms of taxation of land?
Well, farmers would be a primary beneficiary, because one of the most serious problems that farmers have is the entry cost to entering into agriculture, and so land acquisition cost is high. So we get a lot of farmers who lease land from non-farming owners, and those farmers who do acquire land using bank credit at interest, And that's fine as long as commodity prices hold. But if commodity prices fall and the farmer's revenue falls, they're still obligated to pay that bank loan. And if they're leasing the land, they're still obligated to pay the rent to the landowner under that contract. And so they're either going to, whatever savings they have is going to be eroded, or they're going to have to try to refinance to get more debt. And so they get deeper and deeper until eventually we've had, frequent farming crises where farmers go bankrupt. So under the Henry George system, they would have no tax obligations at all for their buildings, their equipment, they would pay no income tax on the revenue that they earn, no business profits tax. So if we went all the way to Georgia's system, the only financial obligation that a farmer would have would be the potential annual rental value of the land held, and the farmer would not use the land for agriculture if its highest best use was otherwise. So there's a lot of synergy here that occurs too, because we have sprawling development now because we have such low effective taxes on land rent. And so we have eaten up a lot of the best agricultural land that's close to population centers. And so farmers have been forced to go into more and more marginal land that requires more and more fertilization, more and more irrigation, et cetera. And it is arguably largely a result of very bad tax policy.
Interesting. Thank you. Giannis, and then Joe.
Yes, thank you, Ed. Very, very rich presentation. Now I have 3 points of contention on the fundamentals. And I think it's a little bit, I don't know how many sessions you're going to have, but I'm having a feeling we're jumping in the deep end to going into the money issues, while we need to first solidify and understand the fundamentals. Now, on the fundamentals, I have 2 points of contention, and I have a third one, which is not about the fundamentals. So, first one.
Well, in the interest of time, just cover one now, Giannis. We don't have much time. We have a few other people.
Fast. Your definition of wealth is missing a key element. You put 3, there is a 4th one that's missing. I can tell you extemporaneously. That's number 1. Number 2, you said something that the actual rent is the potential value. That's not correct. Production has to happen. So it's the rent collected. That's what the rent is. No future. That's what the speculators use. They try to say, oh, what's the projected value in the future, and then they discount it.
That may be your argument, but that's not Henry George's position.
No. You are wrong about that. Production has to happen. So it cannot be future. It cannot be potential. Production has to happen. You are wrong on that. So, and the third contention.
I'm hoping not to see a debate here.
Hold on.
No, it's not a debate. I'm making, a direct point. So, Ed can respond. So my third point of contention is what you said about the nation state. You said the nation state excludes. That's not correct. The nation state does not exclude others. It allows for immigration in, but it protects the improvements that the citizens have made. So actually, it's not exclusion, it's protection of improvements. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead and respond, Ed, and then we'll go to Joe.
Without get to a long debate with Giannis, I partially agree with what he said, but I think it requires a lot more discussion, because just for example, yes, the nation state does protect some, but the nation state excludes some. The basic principle, the moral principle of the earth being our commons requires that we permit people to move to, live to wherever they choose to live on the planet, subject to concerns about health and safety. And so the question is, are the restrictions on migration consistent with that moral principle? That's my point of view. And I would argue that is a view shared by Henry George.
You should apply that to your home.
Thanks,
You
Giannis.
should
We'll get back around to you if you get
and you don't.
Giannis, if we get a chance, we'll get back around to you with another question. I want to get some other people in here. Go ahead, Joe, and then we'll go to Jeff Elder and then Steve.
Great presentation. I introduced the fact that you synthesized an enormous amount of material, and that was very, very much demonstrated. One quick point, and I'll put it in the chat. In 1857, Reverend Twells, TWELLS, spoke to Parliament about the fractional reserve system, and he's explained to them that they didn't have nearly enough gold to have a 100% reserve system like they were advocating that that's what they had. So I'll put that in. Secondly, I'd just like to say that we're in a position today where we're going to have to fight a war on global warming. And the kind of things you talked about today, the kind of things that Henry George talked about and Zarlanga talked about, are the things that we're fighting for, allowing us to have democratic control over the money and using it for this crisis, this looming crisis, the current crisis in inequality and the looming crisis in global warming. So thanks for those tools. And I think we know what we need to do. We have to somehow get everybody mobilized to do it. Thanks, Ed. Great presentation.
Thanks. Go ahead with your question.
I didn't see a question there, so I'm not going to say anything.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Hi, Ed.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah, I just want to know, because we could, again, with participation of the public, improve the, land taxation, make it more fair and equitable. But again, I'll just ask you specifically, I think you've seen the PMC proposal, the homepage. I don't know how closely you looked at it, but
Yeah.
you see that as a possible first step to the kind of reforms Henry George was talking about.
Just for the sake of everybody, before you answer, Ed, Jeff, could you give us a 30-second summary of what it is you're talking about, so everybody else knows what question Ed is answering?
Jeff and I have had a long conversation.
I can tell.
Go ahead, Jeff.
So anyways, a PMC proposal is to, empower the Bank of Canada, but not just the Bank of Canada, but through the auspices of mandates from the public. So there would be referendums, for example, to put more money into healthcare. So people would actually have, a thing that you can vote for to put more money into the Bank of Canada, would create that debt free. And that would not necessarily be inflationary because, of course, it would be going into a productive enterprise. So that's the basic nuts and bolts of it.
Go ahead.
Well, we do many things that mitigate the consequences of our systems of law and public policy, and that's basically what economic policy, in my view, what economic policy does today. It tries to anticipate and then mitigate the shortcomings of how our systems are set up, and none of that represents systemic change. Right. So I'm all for mitigation while we pursue systemic change. There's been a debate among many of the followers of Henry George whether the efforts to get the local property tax reformed to move to a two-rate property tax and eventually to a tax that is on land value only, that exempts property improvements, is enough. What more can we do, or is it really the best we can do given the other problems we have of getting politicians to understand what systemic reforms constitute? So these kinds of discussions can only help because the land and money issues are intimately related, in my view. And again, I spent 40 years making my living selling money to people. And there were pros and cons with how we did that. And they had short-term benefits and some long-term ramifications. I give you one specific example. I worked at Fannie Mae for 20 years. Every year, we look at the median price of a residential property, and based on the increase in those median prices, we met with Freddie Mac, our counterpart, and decided to raise maximum loan limits. So what did raising maximum loan limits do? It validated speculative increases in land prices. But it was the only way, it was only one of the only ways that we could mitigate the market. We could maintain transaction volume and therefore, get the revenue that we needed to satisfy Wall Street, to keep our stock prices up. So you have all these financial players doing similar things to try to mitigate what's happening in the market, but the aggregate effect has an overwhelmingly negative effect in that it adds huge stresses that eventually we calculate every 18 to 21 years bring the system to a near collapse. So, while we pursue mitigation, we have to work toward getting the decision makers in our societies to understand the systemic problems.
Right. And I totally agree with you that the land and money issue are intimately tied. And again, so I agree with pretty much everything you said. So somehow we have to share that message with the world.
Good. Thanks, Jeff. Steve and then Lucille.
Sure. Thanks. Great presentation, Ed. Really appreciate all you did to put this together. And in prepping for this, I discovered there's a Henry George School in my backyard in Philadelphia. So I'll have to keep tabs.
There was.
Oh, it's not there anymore.
No, it operated out of the birthplace of Henry George for a long number of years. But the board of trustees in the main school in New York that owned the building decided to sell it a couple years ago. And so the facility was closed in Philadelphia.
Anyway, here's my question, and I think I'm a little bit behind the rest of you guys on this, but my question is, my understanding is that China's policy on land is that it is all part of the commons owned by all of the citizens, and land is only leased out. It's never owned by individuals. So if my understanding is correct, would you say they've implemented the Georgian model?
I don't know the details, but from what I have read, and I've read what Michael Hudson has written about China because he's had direct experience lecturing there, is that the leases are 99 years. And from what I understand, there's no provision for periodic adjustment in the ground rent charges. And so what happens is as land values or market ground rents increase, that returns an imputed income stream to the lessee, which is capitalized by market forces into a selling price for the leasehold interest. That's nothing unusual. That happens in land trust communities in the United States that were created under the model that Henry George first put up, because, and there are only a couple of them left, but in Arden, Delaware, and in Fairhope, Alabama, which are land trust communities, they do not have a good mechanism for periodically increasing the ground rent charges. And so if you want to buy a residential property in those two communities, you'll pay as much as you would for a house in a neighboring community where you're buying the land. Even though you don't have a deed to the land in the land trust, the total price of the capitalized imputed rental income stream gives the leasehold a price equivalent to what a deed to the land would be. So you've got to do it right, or it's not going to have the results that you're going to hope for. So my my comment to Michael has been, if the Chinese ever get it right, we're in deep trouble.
All right. Thank you very much, Ed.
Thanks. Go ahead, Lucille.
Hi, Ed. Nice to meet you in this forum. If there's time, I have just two clarification questions and then one kind of question of my own. So the first clarification question, I think you said that that George and Henry Georges argued that the rent value belongs to the community as a whole.
Correct.
And can you explain what that means a little more, or why that, what the rationale for it is?
Okay. Well, most of the land rent is created locally, okay, by population coming together in one place to live, work, and play. And so the people in that community directly are involved in making that community a place that people want to live and where business wants to operate. Then there's a secondary relationship of larger communities. So if I live in a city, most of the rental value of the land is associated with the city itself and its activities. But there's the state that provides certain services to the city. There's the national government that provides certain services as well to the city. And one could even argue that the international government, through various functions like enforcement of contracts and other international treaties and such, they have a certain claim on some of the rent. So one economist who's in the Henry George community, Nick Tiedemann, at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, he's written that the ideal way that public revenue should be collected is by local communities, which would then, a portion of that revenue collected would then be distributed upward to higher levels of government based on the value of the services provided. Now, how you're going to, determine those, you're going to need, a good system of evaluating what the value of those higher level services would be. And certainly they're going to be more valuable to some communities than to others based on, the level of higher level services that are provided.
Yeah, it helps. It helps.
Okay.
Probably I need to do some reading. So my second.
Well, look up Nicholas Tiedemann.
Okay. Yeah, I do know him through AMI and have
Okay.
heard him talk. So you referenced earlier that your work for Fannie Mae, and that at the end of your time there, you convinced some people who let you go to the field, basically to try to make the case that Henry George's ideas were somehow relevant, I think, for the housing market. Could you explain that a little in more depth, what you were trying to argue to people? And
well, very simply that the low effective rate of taxation on land made land a very good asset for speculation, and the credit markets were providing funds to speculators. And so, for example, we were working on a project in Philadelphia with a number of nonprofits. Steve may know South Central Philadelphia, which was being, a lot of money was being put in by a record producer named Kenny Gamble, and formed a nonprofit called the Universal Companies. So we were working with them and raising money. We were providing some grant funds and lower interest rate mortgage loans to first-time home buyers, that kind of thing. Well, when we started off on this project, we were able to acquire vacant lots and empty buildings for maybe $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000. Once we had funded the construction of a couple hundred units, speculators came in and bought up all these properties that were still vacant. And so everything that was contiguous to where we were working, the asking price to acquire a vacant lot instead of $1,000 got up to be 15 or 20,000 or 30,000. And so what does that mean? It means you have to raise a lot more subsidy money per unit of affordable housing than if the speculators weren't able to make a profit. And a high annual tax on land, if as land values were increasing, the annual tax on the owners increased at that pace, would have meant that land prices would not have gone up, and we could have built a lot more affordable housing for a lot less money.
Okay.
There was one project out in Western Pennsylvania where the landowners were asking us for $200,000 for an acre of land.
I hear you. Yeah, actually, and I actually am a housing developer, so I know of what you speak is absolutely accurate. And I specifically work in the nonprofit field on tax credit and bond deals, and so yeah, that's directly on point. I'm going to take I have a question actually myself. So under the Henry George system, you just started referring to it a little bit, but I'm curious, is this a state system or a federal system? And so those property taxes just move to the state level and that's it? And then the second part of my question was, I know that under the Henry George system, only land is taxed, I believe, if I'm correct, and that buildings and improvements are not taxed. So how would removing that assessment where they do buildings and land separately, in Henry George's view or in your view, how do states then continue to raise the same amount of money without increasing that initial tax on just the land so they get the same revenues? I know Indianapolis property taxes pay for probably 80–90% of government services. And so if I remove the buildings from that equation, they still need that money. So then do they have to increase the land value?
Well, the argument basically right now is that in most towns and cities, the assessments are probably higher than they ought to be in distressed neighborhoods and much lower than they ought to be in less distressed and prosperous neighborhoods. So the effect of the existing conventional property tax tends to be regressive. So if you live in a neighborhood that's dominated by poor renters, those poor renters are paying higher rents for apartments or for their houses than they need be because the owners are being overtaxed. And in more prosperous neighborhoods, the assessments generally are much lower as a percentage of total market value. So that's a starting point. So you bring a colleague of ours, Ted Dodson, who was the chief assessor in Greenwich, Connecticut before he retired. He made sure his department brought all property assessments up to market value and kept them up to market value. In Greenwich, he said that the assessed value of land represented 70% of the total assessed value. And so by eliminating taxes on property improvements on houses, the increase on land value would have had, to be revenue neutral, wouldn't have to be that high.
Gotcha.
But
then you would say that you would resituate it to make sure that it's more progressive instead of regressive.
Yeah,
so it wouldn't affect
it would definitely have a positive effect on low-income homeowners if those low-income homeowners didn't live in a gentrified neighborhood. Which is why, when I was at Fannie, we always, argued the case for what are called circuit breakers. I'm sure you know that term. So the most appropriate circuit breaker, in my view, is not to forgive taxes that are owed based on the current assessment, but to allow someone to apply for an accrual, based on income. Okay, I can only afford $2,000 a year. I owe $6,000. $4,000 would accrue as a lien against my property when it's transferred to heirs or sold.
Gotcha. Understood.
That's what I would do.
Gotcha. Thank you. Joe, go ahead, and then we'll go back to Lucille.
Lucille, I think you're on. You have to unmute yourself.
No, I'm
That's
okay.
Joe.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, Joe.
I think the game Monopoly was developed to teach George and the money system a long time ago.
It was called the landlord's game back then. Wasn't Monopoly.
No, and the woman, I think, had, as a young person, had met George. Her father was an associate or something. And at any rate, this kind of fits in with everything you've done tonight, that game, I think. This is a question I'll ask. There is sort of a monetary authority, which is what the Need Act envisions, and issues all the money. And then the rentiers end up collecting it all. They monopolize it, if you like. And is it true, or do you think that, if we don't pay attention to the Henry George analysis, that is the great threat to monetary reform? That is, we could take control of the money system, but the rentiers would keep monopolizing the money. It would flow back to them if we don't learn how to tax the rentiers so that the money is returned back to the community. It stays in the community.
Complicated issue, Joe, and we have many contradictory policies in place that redistribute purchasing power. And so, for example, let's assume that the U.S. Treasury would take over the responsibility for spending money on infrastructure. In other words, it could just simply, print the money at the printing presses and then deposit that in the Treasury account, and all of that money would be spent on infrastructure. Well, people are going to get income from that, and they're going to have that as disposable income. So if disposable incomes increase and there's no increase in the supply of housing, what's going to happen to the cost of housing? It's going to go up. So it's the same thing as when I talk about the impact of a universal basic income. Give everyone $1,000, don't increase the supply of housing, and you're going to get rising rents and rising housing prices. So it means, in my view, that absent the taxation of land values, as Henry George proposed, then the policy must be accompanied by a substantial allocation of funds toward the construction of affordable housing. And permanently affordable housing that has, a restrictive covenant on who it can be resold to. And, you can use other measures like inclusionary zoning to get developers. You give them increased density and they'll construct 20% of the units they construct must be affordable to households with an income, let's say, under 80% of area median income. So there are different ways to do it, but what many thoughtful people are running up to in their own communities is not in my backyard. I don't want all these townhouses built for young families because they're going to bring children. The children are going to go in the school district. The school district's going to increase its taxes or take on bond debt. And so my taxes are going to increase. So I'm voting against affordable housing.
That's how it works.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Lucille.
Ain't it grand?
Yeah, so I think Joe's question kind of was in the direction of what mine was. Mine maybe just be a little broader or general, but to ask you, Ed, what, as yourself and as a Henry Georgist or informed by the Henry George School of Thinking and Literature, what is your perspective on sovereign money and just money reform? Do you advocate it? Do you support it? Do you understand it? Do you critique it? Do you criticize it?
I include it in the menu of options that I think need to be considered. And my basic view is it's certainly much more just to have the U.S. government directly issue and spend money into circulation than to allow the Federal Reserve to basically have Federal Reserve notes printed, which are then used, or the digital equivalent, to loan money to the U.S. Treasury at interest and create a secondary market in government debt. So I think I support the issuance of debt-free money, subject to constraints. As I said, I guess I favor the use of that money to pay for infrastructure, not just building bridges and roads and such, but social infrastructure as well. Contributions to the construction, to the funding of social welfare programs, daycare, education, et cetera. Those I would support. But I have my own thoughts too about other options that ought to be considered. I'm a fan of the Bank of Amsterdam and of receipt money. But I realize that it's not a good idea to back receipt money with gold or precious metals. I mean, why? We have a lot of that money, all that stuff sitting around in vaults now. Okay, but digging it up out of the ground costs a lot. It pollutes the environment. Then we refine it. We turn it into bullion, and then we store it in vaults that have to be guarded by complex and expensive security systems. So, I always thought, well, what can we do as an alternative to that? And there are a couple of things that I think have influenced me. One was, and I'll mention Nick Tiedemann again. I was on a trip with him to Russia to talk about, with the Russian government, about privatization. And in that trip, Nick said to me, I met with some Russian economists when I was here before, and I suggested to them that they might want to back their currency with construction bricks. Construction bricks. Well, I thought it was an idea to consider after talking to Nick, and then I found out it has a history. There are other economists who argued for construction bricks to back currency. Well, what about construction bricks? In a sense, they have all the positive characteristics of precious metals and none of the negative. They have a global demand, stable price. They last almost forever, and yet you don't have to fill a warehouse with them and guard them. You can produce construction bricks at a standard content and a standard weight, just like coinage, and issue currency backed by that could be exchanged. Now, it doesn't have to be the only currency in circulation, but I thought that's one idea. And I guess I've been corrected on who originated the idea. I thought it was Buchanan, but maybe it was Jeff that told me it wasn't. I don't remember. But the other thing that I've thought about is, we do have all this gold now and silver sitting around in vaults. Well, different countries have a lot of it. Maybe we could get a treaty that would get countries to agree to monetize a good portion of that currency, that coinage, that bullion, and turn it into coins that in every country have the same metallic content, and then issue currency backed by it, digital currency or whatever. But so there could be more than one types of coinage in circulation. You could have the coinage back, the full reserve money with certificates of deposit in circulation. You could have the brickback currency in circulation, and you could have the government notes with no specific backing whatsoever, but those notes would be used, or their digital equivalent used, to pay taxes. And so you have a hybrid system that I think has a potential to work pretty well.
Cool.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, good question, Lucille. I'm glad you asked that, and I like your answer, Ed.
You do?
Yeah, I do actually.
I'm writing that down, Jeff.
I'll tell you why. Is because I still believe in exploring other options. It's just that, and I have explored the options. In fact, most of the people here, I think, are pretty familiar with the historical aspects of your talk. But I just see it as monetary reform as kind of the first step, is to, democratize the banking and financial system. So yeah, I agree in exploring other things, and we're not kind of closed-minded here. Like, if we can get like fair taxation, for the upper echelon, and if somehow that's actually transferred to people who actually need it, well, that's great. But again, of course, you realize our core issue is to actually fundamentally change the banking system. So over to you.
I don't know. I mean, we're all in this lifeboat together, and the pressures on our systems right now are intense. And I guess, from my interaction with others who embrace Henry George's analysis, many of us believe that the next crisis will be the worst ever. And the question is not if it's going to come, but when it's going to come, and whether or not we have sufficient time, even if we did all these great things to prevent that collapse from occurring. And the estimate is it could be 2026 to 2028, somewhere in that period of time. And as I mentioned earlier, I've done on my website, on my YouTube channel, I have a video that presents the case, the argument in statistics of why I think 2026 is going to bring a systemic crash. And you can take a look at that if you go to my YouTube channel. But again, we have a combination of record high property prices, record high consumer debt, record high defaults on a lot of consumer debt. People don't know that one of the largest segments of student loan debt in the United States is senior citizens. And senior citizens are being caught very heavily by falling interest income as interest rates have been driven down to negative, effectively negative or almost negative. So people on retirement who even have investment portfolios are forced to put their investment advisor is saying you can't invest in fixed income assets, you have to invest in the stock market. Whoa. No. I mean, if you're 74 years old, what you want is asset preservation. You're not necessarily interested in growth opportunities anymore.
Yeah,
So,
I couldn't argue with the situation as being bleak, especially in Canada. Our debt to per capita is actually higher than the United States, but our actual federal government is kind of in better shape, and just as a result, the Bank of Canada actually absorbs a lot of security issues, almost like 13%. So, and that's probably why we have the lowest debt to GDP ratio, is that the Bank of Canada regularly absorbs those things. So, but is from the private standpoint, just exactly what you said, like people are living paycheck to paycheck, and that's over 50% of our population is doing that.
yeah.
So
Well, I don't know, I don't know how to compare your social welfare, safety net to the United States, but I can tell you that here, 1 out of 4 senior citizens lives on Social Security benefits alone. They have no pension, no savings. And then if you go up to 50% of seniors in the United States have no more savings than 6 months. So
yeah, our senior situation is slightly better because we do have Canada Pension and old age pension. So those are guaranteed incomes for people. And of course, we also have Medicare for All, which is a huge cost benefit to senior citizens. Whereas, you have Medicaid in the United States, but it's nothing like Canada. Nobody's in fear of going bankrupt because they get sick.
yeah.
So we're better.
I'd hope that you guys could bring it on a lighter note, but you're pressing me. Yeah, 2026, really? Let's take our last question. We have 6 minutes left. Yanis, you have your hands up. Do you have a question?
Yeah, it's more of a comment on the discussion about the monetary reform. And of course, I'm gonna conjecture, and I'm gonna say, of course, we cannot debate it here, but I hope in the course of the lectures, this issue is gonna be fleshed out more. Like, my assertion is that the rental income taxation, which is the equivalent term of land value taxation, okay, will solve the need for monetary reform. Because if you solve where the money goes, and the money only goes to productive activity, that's it. That's the end of it. You don't need any more monetary reform. The reason we have problems with our monetary system is because the money is printed, by a few privileged groups, and it's directed to another privileged group, and then everybody else is bled dry. That problematic system is solved by rental income taxation.
Thanks, Yanis. Did you want to respond, Ed?
I don't really. The problem we have is, at best, we can hope for incremental mitigating reforms because there's no understanding of the systemic flaws at the highest level of discourse. Even among conventional economists, they're still convinced that neoclassical economics, neoliberal policies will work their magic. The problem is they work magic only after significant collateral damage. So, if you're in the group that isn't affected, if you're not part of the collateral damage, then you say, "Oh, I made it through the crisis." But look at the fact that we have large and growing tent cities around every major city in the United States, of people living in tents under bridges, even with jobs, working people. It's a tragedy, and it's shameful, and it's not necessary, but it is our reality. And we're voices in the wilderness.
Do you have any more uplifting final notes?
Well, let me put it this way. I teach a semester-long course on the state of the U.S. economy and our society. And the PowerPoint that I prepare for that course usually goes out to subscribers. I have about 700 subscribers to the material. And it's a pretty depressing story, I'm sorry to say. I have decided I failed to update it for a year because I thought the economy was in such a state of flux that I wasn't sure the statistics were telling me what I needed to tell my audience. But at the end of the course, when I teach it in the classroom and everyone is looking really depressed and want to know what they can do, and I said, here's my advice. Pay off your debt to the extent you can. Try to get at least 6 months of living expenses in the bank. And when all else fails, fill your basement up with canned goods. So,
Okay. Well, with that, 2 minutes left. Thanks, Ed, for a great talk. We appreciate your knowledge on the subject and appreciate everybody's questions and everybody's attendance. Ryan, where are you at? I know there is the next coffee house is in December.
right
Ryan.
here.
Okay, jump in and tell us.
Thank you, Ed. Hopefully
thank
I
you for the
can.
invitation.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully I can end things on a positive note. Let's see how this goes. So yeah, our next coffee house is December 13th. I'm going to drop the registration link in the chat. The Youth Caucus will be hosting that, and it's themed Simplifying Monetary Reform Stories with the Youth Caucus. So it will be interactive, and we'll be hopefully sharing our monetary reform stories with each other. Awesome. Next on, I just have a couple more announcements. I'm keeping it brief, folks.
All right.
So yeah, we are a member organization, and so if you would like to get involved, be kept up to date with what's going on, please check out our Get Involved page, become a member, subscribe to our newsletter. That's a great place to stay up to date on things. And my last shout out is about Giving Tuesday. That is next Tuesday, and I hope that you will consider donating to us, as we are run on your donations, and that will help us secure our staffing, put on great events, and help us with our outreach efforts. So please consider donating, and the link for that is right here. And those are my announcements.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Once again, a good round of applause for Ed. Thanks for attending. Hopefully we'll
Thanks
see you in the
everyone for
future.
the great questions, and I hope I've given you something to think about.
Definitely, you know, and I'll say this, that in the redesign of what we try to do in our monetary system as monetary reformers, taxation always comes up. And so I think one thing that I know some of us agree on is that how we tax, why we tax, all that needs to be rethought. And so just knowing the historical knowledge of how taxes have come from penalizing to supporting all of revenue, all those things are helpful in us trying to figure out how this new path can get here before 2026, hopefully. So we'll have a good plan in place before everything crashes. So.
Okay, Mark, well, thanks a lot. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody.
Thank you. And bye-bye to everybody else. Everybody have a good Thanksgiving.
Good night,
If you
all.
celebrate it. If not,
Thank you, Ed. Thank you all.
have a good week.
Thank
See
you,
you guys.
CW.